Yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. For those who were here last week, we began by exploring the Ottoman Empire essentially from 1517 onward. And what we began with was a discussion about how the kind of mainstream narrative around Ottoman history is that after the siege of Vienna or the Battle of Lepanto, that it's basically a 500-year history of decline, is mostly nonsense. Now, I have to say that usually I have slides, and I plan to have a series of slides for you guys. Like many of you, I was very emotionally distracted this week, shall we say, with everything that's going on. In fact, I suspect that some people in the question and answer may want to have, or may have, some quick questions about the contemporary situation. I'll try to wrap up, inshallah, around 7:45-ish to be able to allow for like a good, vibrant 15-minute question and answer. So I have to start with some terms and definitions, and I know that's not always the most fun, but without starting with these terms and definitions, the rest of my presentation this evening won't make sense. We use the term nation-state very frequently, like it's synonymous with countries. So the entire global order of Canada and the United States and France and Germany and Belgium and India, Pakistan, these are nation-states. But we generally have a pretty poor understanding of what those words actually mean. And the reason we have such a poor understanding of it is because the nation-state system was so successful that asking us to define what a nation-state is similar to like asking a fish what water is. It's just the world that we live in. Okay? But a nation-state is a very particular thing. It's a very specific thing. A nation is a group that shares a common understanding of the past, a common understanding of the present, or rather a common story of the past, a common understanding of the present, and a common vision for the future. So I'll repeat that one because that's a mouthful, right? A nation shares a common story of the past, a common understanding of the present, and a common vision of the future. You think of any nations that you belong to, and on some level, you share those qualities with your nation. A state is an institution that possesses a monopoly on violence. The most foundational characteristic of the state is that it has complete control over the use of violence. Now, there are some of my I'm a teacher. I teach grade 6 and 7, and some of my students are here this evening, and they might be chuckling to themselves because this was like a central part of grade 6 social studies in my class. And so I have to explain a little bit what is the relationship. I have to explain the relationship between the state and violence. In order for the state to deliver any of the services that we believe a state to be responsible for delivering, and if we had a conversation right now, in the interest of time, I'm going kind of quickly, but if we thought about any of the services that the state is responsible for delivering, healthcare, police, fire services, electricity, water, any of those things, what does the state have to do first in order to be capable of delivering any of those services? Taxes. Even to deliver law and order, it needs to first collect taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes willingly. And the perfect example of this is when you go through the Tim Hortons lineup and they say, do you want to donate $1 to like a children's charity or camp or whatever it is? Sometimes you say yes. A whole bunch of the time you say no. You want to see these services, but you don't want to pay for it. And even less, you don't want to be compelled to pay for it. A state must possess complete control over the use of violence. Otherwise, it cannot successfully collect taxes. Imagine if the state came to collect taxes and you said, no, I'm good. I don't feel like paying taxes. And then they came with a few of their, goons, and they said, hey, well, first of all, actually, that's not how it works in the modern world. Even today, like if we look at an example like Canada, if you refuse to pay your taxes, they're going to send you a pretty angry letter, right? And the letter is probably going to have a court appearance in it. And if you refuse to show up to court, then they're going to send you another letter and saying, now you're in trouble for two things. You failed to appear in court and you didn't pay your taxes. And if you don't show up to your next court appearance, the state will send men and women of violence to come and coerce you to either go to court or go to jail or pay your taxes. Now, if you respond to those men and women of violence with machine gun fire and Katyusha rockets, that's a problem. And at that point, even in this country, the Canadian government will send you a police battalion, they will send the military, they will send the Air Force. They will spend way more money than what your taxes are worth in order to compel you to pay your taxes, because in principle, the state cannot allow anyone to contest its monopoly on violence. At the most foundational level, that's what a state is. A nation is a common story, a common group that understands the past, present, and future in a very similar way. A state is an institution that possesses complete control on violence. The nation state is the institutional manifestation of the national story backed by state instruments of coercion. Basically what that means is the nation state are all of the institutions and all of the symbols that you see here in this country with maple leafs and beavers and buffaloes and all of those symbols that you and I all recognize as Canadian. That's the nation state. That's what it is. So why bother telling you all of these things? Because in the 1820s, the Ottoman Empire was neither a nation nor was it a state. It was neither of these things. The Ottoman Empire did not have a single story that united all of its disparate groups. The Ottoman Empire was the most diverse place in the history of the world prior to the American Empire, prior to the rise of America and the New World. The world had never seen anything like it. Every major religion that you could imagine, massively represented in the Ottoman Empire, huge numbers, right? Every ethnic group that you can imagine, every language group that you can imagine, spread across 3 continents. It's unbelievable. There's so much diversity. So no, in the 1820s, there was no such thing as an Ottoman identity. Equally as important, the Ottomans did not possess a monopoly on violence in its peripheries. In the Ottoman provinces, peripheral regions away from Istanbul, they were mostly self-ruled. What I mean is that they ruled with, there's like somebody who pays tribute to the Ottomans, essentially like they pay taxes to the Ottoman, not essentially, literally, they paid taxes to the Ottoman government. And the Ottoman government would, anoint this person with a prestigious title of some kind. Okay? But basically, people were self-ruled. They didn't see the central government very often. And in the event when the central government and a local ruler had a conflict, the Ottomans, I don't want to say frequently, but frequently enough, lost. Like sometimes they did not have the ability to challenge these local strongmen, whether it was in Syria or whether it was in Iraq or whether it was in Anatolia or whether it was in Egypt and other parts of North Africa. They couldn't. The Ottomans did not possess complete control over the use of violence. All of this doesn't matter that much until the Greek revolt of 1820. And that is an event that spiraled everything out of control. We call Greeks Greek, and I'm not an expert in Greek nationalism or the Greek revolt or Greek history, but up until that point in their history, they referred to themselves, and the Ottomans referred to them as Romans. Now here's another important thing to say before I move on. In your imagination, who is the successor state to Rome? Like when you think today, Rome kind of collapsed, but Rome didn't really collapse like the Soviet Union did. It took a lot longer, it was very slow, and Rome kind of just became a church. The Roman Empire basically became two churches. So who's the successor to the Roman Empire? Like right now, today, in your imagination, who do you think is the successor to the Roman Empire? Does the Roman Empire have a successor? Does it still exist in any way? And if not today, then was there ever a successor to the Roman Empire? What do you guys think? Yes? Okay, so many would contend that the Byzantines they weren't just the successors to the Roman Empire, they literally were the Roman Empire. They were the Eastern Roman Empire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to them as a Rum, right? So, like they were Rome. Only in modern times did we retroactively call them Byzantium. They referred to themselves as Romans. The Ottomans thought of themselves as the successors to Rome, to Rome's legacy, to Rome's territorial gains, to Rome's power, to Rome's prestige. In the Ottoman imagination, they were Rome. Okay? To the extent that for a long time, Ottoman sultans called themselves, in addition to Amir al-Mu'mineen, in addition to Salatin, or like a Sultan, Holy Roman emperors. They thought of themselves as the successors to Rome. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you that in Christian Europe, they didn't like this very much. The Greek revolt was aided and backed by every major power in Europe. Again, I'm not an expert on the grievances of the Greeks. I'm sure they had legitimate grievances. I'm sure they also had probably some illegitimate grievances, but whatever the case, they revolted. But their revolt was sponsored by every major European power. And there's a reason for that. Because in the European imagination of the time, Greece was to represent the real successor to Rome. And that's a legacy. You know, this whole series was about the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. That is a legacy that we live with to this very day. Think about this for a second. How many of you were educated in the Canadian school system? Like how many of you went to elementary or high school and university here? Hands up. Hands up. Okay. If you're a product of the Canadian education system, then at some point you studied some like kind of fictional story about this imaginary connection between ancient Greece and democracy and Rome and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and us. Okay. Greece gave Europe the ability to tell that story, because so long as the Muslims were Rome, that story doesn't work. They can't tell that story. Now, there are a bunch of reasons of why they want to start telling these stories and structural reasons for why they'd want to start doing these things, but I have a lot of threads that I'm trying to follow. So the Greek revolt exposed another problem, though, which is that since the Greek revolt was backed by every single major European power, every major European power wanted to see Greece succeed. And so, with Greek independence in like roughly 1829, every major European power is making sure that literacy goes up, industrialization goes up, agriculture goes up. All of these things are destined, now must improve. Because we are going to prove, we being the great powers of Europe, that the only reason that Greece was so behind was because they were under Muslim rule. But now that they've been liberated from Muslim rule and they are an autonomous nation state, they are going to have improved literacy, improved financial situation, improved industrialization, and all of those things. What do you think happened to all of the other Christian communities in the Roman Empire at that point? Suddenly, independence sounds like a great idea. It sounds like the best idea, because Greece is doing so much better. The Serbians, the Bulgarians, the Armenians, the Maronites, the Coptic Christians, everyone suddenly is looking at this saying, what are we doing? Why would we want to continue living like this? If the great powers of Europe are going to be able to intervene in that way and prop us up and make everything better, surely it makes for independence as an attractive option. At the same time that this is happening, and I mentioned this very briefly last time, (1820), the Greek revolt begins. Approximately 1829, the Greek revolt ends. And in 1820, the first Protestant American missionaries arrive in Palestine. And within the century, within the 19th century, there are hundreds of thousands, even 200,000 missionaries throughout the Ottoman Empire. These are insane numbers. Okay? And they are everywhere. And so you have a situation where Christian populations are beginning to separate. You have a situation where Christian missionaries are suddenly everywhere all across the country or all across the empire. And you also have a situation where strongmen rule basically as autonomous rulers all over the Ottoman Empire. And if you have something like this, it makes it very difficult, very, very difficult for the Ottomans to collect taxes. It makes it very difficult for the Ottomans to also engage in any kind of modernization because they don't have access to any of their resources because they can't collect taxes. They're not physically present in these places. I will add one other thing, which is that in the early 1820s, the Ottoman army was basically a slave army, the Janissaries. And the Janissaries were no longer like the formidable fighting force that they were in like the 14th, 15th, 16th century. They've become pretty bloated. They're essentially like very, very well-connected bureaucrats. Very difficult to work around them. Incredibly powerful figures. And in the early 1820s, the Ottomans decide, well, we're just going to get rid of them. And in like the span of a week, the army devours itself and they kill almost all of the Janissaries. So the Greek revolt took place when the Ottomans had annihilated their previous army, but had not yet built up their new army. You now have Christian separatism all over the place. You have Christian missionaries flooding into the empire, and you have independent strongmen ruling, sometimes very tyrannically. The ulama of the Ottoman Empire, primarily through Sufi tariqas, and directly through the wives and the mothers of successive sultans, pressure the Ottoman sultans to regain control. Things have gone nuts. Like, we've lost control. You must regain order. Now, something I didn't mention here is that in between this time period, like right at the end of the Greek revolt and throughout the 1830s, one of these Ottoman strongmen, Muhammad Ali Pasha, okay, the independent ruler of Egypt, actually declares independence in Egypt and doesn't just take Egypt, but takes Egypt, Mecca, Medina, Iraq, the entire Hijaz. He takes the entirety of Asham and parts of Anatolia. Suddenly the Ottoman Empire is half its size because one of its previous vassals now rules as an independent sovereign. This lasts for about 10 years, between 1830 and 1839, until the Ottomans are finally convinced we need to regain order. And in 1839, the Ottoman Sultan issues, I believe it was Sultan Abdul-Majid, issues a proclamation known as the Tanzimat. In hindsight, we refer to it as the first Tanzimat, the first reorganization. And this first phase of the Tanzimat was designed to establish order, to reinforce the Sharia, to rein in tyrants and strongmen, to stop separatism. This is what the Tanzimat, the first stage of the Tanzimat, was designed to do. And it accomplished very little. A lot of state building is a chicken and egg problem. Like, how do you build an army if you don't have any officers to train your soldiers? How do you build schools when you don't have any teachers? How do you build factories when you don't have any engineers? Like, how do you do anything? So these are like very complicated problems. So the first stage of the Tanzimat was very, very emphatically proposed, but its accomplishments were quite little. Christian separatism increased, and not only that, and this is like super important to the story that I want to convey to you tonight. The nature of capitalism is really quite straightforward. The objective is to make as much money as possible and to have your money working for you all the time. Well, the great powers of Europe, through their missionaries, are able to funnel in money into the Ottoman Empire, but they don't actually want the Ottoman Empire to access any of that wealth. So the money of the Christian powers of Europe flows primarily through indigenous Jews and Christians. That is, groups like the Greek Orthodox of Palestine, or the Maronites of Lebanon, or the Copts of Egypt, or the Armenians, or the Catholics, all of those who are Arabic-speaking, Kurdish-speaking, Turkish-speaking, but belong to those religious groups, they suddenly have access to unbelievable sums of money. So you need to look at this from the perspective of the Muslims. Suddenly, like, their Christian neighbors are way wealthier than they are. And of course, this is not true for every single Christian, but it was true of enough of them. So now suddenly, in a place like Palestine, where religious tension historically was quite low, now with both separatism and capitalism adding fuel to the fire, tensions quickly begin to increase. But tensions don't just increase between Muslims and Christians. Tensions also increase between Christians and other denominations of Christianity, because all of the great powers of Europe all have their own horse in the race. The Russians are quite close to the Orthodox because they are Orthodox Christians. The Italians sponsor the Catholics. The English and the Americans are out there trying to convert people to Protestant Christianity and bring them into their sphere of influence. And any Lebanese here? Anyone from Lebanon? Okay, so last week there was, but in like the weirdest anomaly of history is that the Americans went really, really, really heavy in sponsoring the Druze. Because the Americans had this belief that the Druze were the most likely people to convert to Christianity en masse. Now, any indigenous people would have said, like, you morons, that these people did not convert to anything ever. Like, they didn't become Sunni, they didn't become Shia, they didn't become, like, they live in mountains specifically so nobody tries to convert them. And they've remained that way for like a really long time. But for whatever reason, the Americans were very invested in their belief that the Druze were going to convert to Protestant Christianity. And the Druze were really happy to let them think that. And they would send them things like the Druze tribal chiefs would say, oh, like if you help us with this, I think it will, bring us closer to Christ. Like, hilarious things, but it was, all just smoke and mirrors. In the early 1850s, so I think now we're at like 1852, there is a dispute between two denominations of Christianity in Palestine, between Palestinian Catholics and between Palestinian Orthodox. Now the dispute is like not enormous and pretty localized. But the Russian Empire goes to the high port, that is, goes to the Sultan, and says, we need to protect all of the Christian Orthodox, so you need to put every single one of them under our sovereignty. Essentially, the Russians were asking for a state within a state. We want to place every single Orthodox Christian in the Ottoman Empire under our sovereignty. And of course, that was something the Ottomans could not accept, but it was also something that the British and the French could not accept either, because it would give the Russians a disproportionate advantage within the Ottoman Empire. The Russians responded to the Ottoman refusal by invading the peninsula of Crimea, thus sparking the Crimean War, otherwise known as a proto-world war. So just try to wrap your head around what I've just told you. A dispute between two monks in Al-Quds gave enough pretext to the Russian Empire to shatter Ottoman rule in modern-day Ukraine. None of this needed to make sense. It didn't need to, because that's what power is. It's the ability to stop making sense with impunity. This colossal conflict, it was huge, and it killed hundreds of thousands. And it was a precursor to what the world was about to see in the First World War, but like 60 years earlier. It brought the Ottomans closer to the British sphere of influence out of necessity. And the British made it very clear to the Ottomans that we would be much more willing, or we would be in a much better position to help protect your sovereignty if you treated your Christians better. This is at a time when Britain was referring to Sudan as the human zoo, right? This is at a time where the British would go into places like Tanzania, skin the indigenous people, and make cigarette pouches out of them. Like, the hubris, right, is staggering that the British are telling the Ottomans that if you treated your minorities better, then we would be in a better position to help you. The Ottomans, with their back to the wall, facing a relentless Russian Empire, and in their corner is a friend who is actually an enemy, release the Second Tanzimat Proclamation. And in 1856, the Second Tanzimat Proclamation officially abolishes the Sharia in the Ottoman Empire. That's it. From now on, Christians, Jews, and Muslims will be governed by a secular law. So, for purposes of marriage, inheritance, and death, Muslims can continue to access the Sharia courts, But the Sharia courts will no longer be the primary legal system in the Ottoman Empire. The primary legal system will be a civil legal code equally accessible to all parties. I've spoken about this subject with audiences that are not just in Masjid. Okay? I have a sense of how the people in this audience feel about that bit of information, because it feels like a betrayal, and it feels like nifaq, like it feels like hypocrisy. What you can go home believing with certainty is that this was wildly resented by the overwhelming majority of Ottoman Muslims. So this did not happen with their consent or with their approval, nor were they pleased about it. So on the one hand, there are missionaries and ambassadors who are more powerful than the governors and the wazirs. They are funneling money to the Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire, rapidly advancing their position. At the same time, you have an Ottoman legal system that has now further propelled the Christian populations and also put them in a seemingly more advantageous position. In the perspective of the Muslims, they are losing their world. Their whole world is collapsing around them. And the Sultan is supposed to be the protector of the world's Muslims, and suddenly it doesn't really feel like that. It feels like the Christians are getting help from the European powers, but they're also getting help from the Sultan. In Lebanon, the Maronite Christians, the Druze, the Sunni Muslims, the Shia, they had their divisions, but the elite of these groups all had their own peasant communities that they kind of controlled, and these peasant communities were also cross-sectarian. That means like a Sunni landlord might have Shia peasants and Druze peasants and Maronite peasants, and a Maronite landlord might have this like cross-sectarian collection of peasants. And the primary division in Lebanon for centuries was economic. The American missionaries ruffled that right up. And they were speaking about things that the Lebanese Ottoman elite told them, we don't speak that way. Like the way that you're talking about religion and the way that you're talking about other religious communities, we don't speak like that here. And as Usama Maqdisi says in his book, Artillery of Heaven, it's my favorite line in that book. He says, the missionaries spoke much, but they listened very little. Because to them, these are just savages. Like, their opinions are not that important. Okay? So we know what we're doing, and we know how to preach Christianity, and we know how to spread this religion to other places. So suddenly you have these tensions that never existed before. You have this just meteoric improvement in the economic situation in the minorities of the Ottoman Empire. You have the resentment of the Muslims, and all of this explodes in 1860. In 1860, there is a massive civil war that erupts in Lebanon, and there are thousands killed. And it's a really uncharacteristic display of sectarian violence up until that point in Lebanon. It's characteristic now of Lebanon, like the Lebanon that we know today, but it was not characteristic of Lebanon up to that point. Now the casualties, they vary, and like there's never really a good number for casualties. Like there's not a number that you should be happy with to say, okay, 10,000 people were massacred or 5,000 people were massacred. Like no massacre is a good massacre. Okay? But the massacre would have been a lot bigger had it not been for the intervention of one man. There was a point, that, and I should say that the civil war was primarily fought between the Druze and the Maronites, but it spread all over Mount Lebanon and into Syria as well. Not really too much into Palestine, incidentally. But at one point in Syria, a group of Christians, really about 10,000 of them, were on the edge of slaughter. And out of nowhere, and like, unfortunately, I don't have the time to tell you this whole story, but they're really on the edge of annihilation. And out of nowhere appears Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. Now, I don't know if you know who this is, but like, you could put him in the same league as Salah ad-Din. He fought against the French in Algeria for 2 decades and was eventually exiled into Syria. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi really swoops in, saves these Christian communities. Otherwise, the death toll of that civil war would have been, substantially higher than the one that history recorded. The Ottomans look at the wreckage of this sectarian violence and desperately need to establish control. And so I'll tell you the last 2 things that they did, both of which are very, very relevant for today. Number 1, the Ottomans could not continue to have a situation where tribes basically have private militias. And in a place like Ottoman Palestine, these tribes that I'm talking about, when I say they had militias, they had citadels rivaling those of like the Medicis and the Borgias. Okay, in the mountains of places like Nablus, these were fortresses that could house 2,000 fighters, horses, enough food for months. And the Ottomans found this situation to be untenable. And so when some instability erupted around Palestine in the 1860s, the Ottomans came to crack down, except this time they came with the single most, I repeat, the single most important technological innovation in the history of indigenous pacification and counterinsurgency, and that is the repeating rifle. So prior to the repeating rifle, a rifle took a really long time to load. I'm sure you guys have seen the movies, where you need to pour like gunpowder in it, and then you get that like brush to stuff all the gunpowder down, and then you put a bullet in and fire it. A repeating rifle allows you to put successive bullets in and just go bang, 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 and then reload. And this was a game changer. 500 Ottoman soldiers could do what previously took like 10,000 of them. And they just ran roughshod through the Ottoman peripheries. It's interesting to note that this happened at the same time that the Americans were running through the Comanche. See, I don't know if you know anything about what Americans call the Plain Indians, but the Comanche could fire arrows faster than the Americans could fire bullets. You guys need to watch this on YouTube or something, but to see the Comanche, what the Comanche could do with arrows was unbelievable. And until the invention of the revolver, the repeating rifle itself was an American invention, so we have them to thank for that. But until the invention of the repeating rifle and the revolver, the Comanche had the military advantage over the Americans. Now suddenly with the revolver, that's it, it's game over. There's nothing that competed with this. It was the first true weapon of mass destruction. Now I need to pause here to say something really important. Last week I mentioned the Ottoman Empire is not 500 years of decline, but I also mentioned that it is not heaven on earth. Like, the things that I'm telling you here, they're not super flattering for Ottoman history, nor are they worthy of your contempt. The real story of the late Ottoman Empire is not a story of religious conservatism meets secular liberalism. It is not a story of sectarian tension. The real story of the late Ottoman Empire is a central government fighting for its survival, attempting to fend off the sharks of Europe, and an Ottoman periphery who resisted that centralization with everything they had. This is the dominant theme of the late Ottoman Empire. And so the disarmament of the peasants became a hugely important part of late Ottoman rule. But it's really hard to collect taxes if you don't know where people are. Think about how many touch points the state has with you right now, like in your pocket. You have a social insurance number, you have a driver's license, you have a health care card number. Like the state has so much data about you. You have a credit card, your credit card company is certainly selling that information to somebody. The state has so many touch points with you. The Ottomans didn't have that about their population. The Ottomans generally had very, very, very little census data. In fact, everybody had very little census data. I've got 2 kids, buddy. If you're trying to distract me, you're not doing a good job. You can do this all day. The Ottomans had very little census data. And not just that, but if you don't know where people live and you don't know how many of them live there, then you have no idea how many taxes that you should be expecting. You can't even project what you're going to do in the future. And not only that, but if you have no idea how many people live in a particular place, how are you going to conscript soldiers to fight these super brutal wars with these emerging superpowers? And so to resolve all of these problems, in 1858, the Ottomans introduce a new Land Reform Act. Prior to 1858, land in the Ottoman Empire, particularly importantly, most importantly, land in places like Ottoman Palestine, were communally held. A group of people held land communally. A whole tribe held land communally. The 1858 land laws mandated that people should privatize their land. That is, they needed to register their land in their name. Now imagine if you were a Palestinian peasant and some Ottoman official comes to you and he says, I need you to register your land. You say, why would I do that? He says, oh, so I can tax you more and conscript your son to go fight in a war in a place that you've never heard of. Does that sound like a very appealing option for you? So you can imagine that the vast majority of peasants, particularly in places like Palestine, did not register their land at all. Or they had it registered, this is the best case scenario, they had it registered in the names of notables in the big cities who could pay the bribes that could get their sons out of things like military conscription. Or in the worst case scenario, greasy notables way outside of Palestine, in places like Lebanon and Syria and in Halab and Tarablis and Beirut and elsewhere, managed to have land registered in their name that they either never paid for or in some cases paid pennies for. The entire area of Marj ibn Amir in Palestine is approximately the size of Boston, and adjusted to inflation, it was purchased for less than the price of a house in Vancouver today. Adjusted to inflation. Suddenly, as the 19th century wore on, the vast majority of Ottoman peasants, again, in places like Palestine, found themselves landless without even realizing that they had become landless, because their life did not actually change. Nothing changed in their life other than a piece of paper exchanged hands between 2 people somewhere else. And this would not matter for a really long time. But when it mattered a lot. I think I can stop there, because that's a lot of information for one day. So the period that we covered today was the period of the Tanzimat, stretching roughly from like 1840, well, we started before that. We started with the Greek Revolt. So we went from 1820 till about the 1860s. So inshallah, next week, we will cover the era of Sultan Abdul Hamid, which is broken down chronologically. It's a next major era in late Ottoman history. I think it would be inappropriate to end the evening without saying anything about the contemporary situation. So I'll say a few things. If you are in a position of strength, if you are powerful, and you choose non-violence, that is a choice that you can make. It is a legitimate, ethical position that you can take. If you are weak and you have chosen non-violence, you actually haven't chosen it. It was chosen for you. Those are not the same thing. So if you are weak and you have chosen forget non-violence, let's put that aside. If you are weak and you have chosen non-confrontation, okay, forget violence, let's just say non-confrontation, this is not contrary to the beliefs of many. This is in fact an unethical position. This is a position that was forced on you and not a position that you have taken with any agency or sovereignty. The other thing that I will say is that in the Muslim world, we think of Gaza as the place most under Israeli occupation. It is the place with the most severe and draconian form of Israeli settler colonialism. I will tell you that is not true. The entire Muslim world is under Israeli occupation, and Gaza is the freest place in the Muslim world. It is the only place that is not colonized by the Israelis. I, over the last week, have felt every emotion that you can imagine. But the primary emotion that reigns supreme above all else is shame. We should be ashamed. Because there's no way that this makes sense, like the situation that we find ourselves in as Muslims. We should be embarrassed. And what makes me particularly ashamed is when I hear the voices of the people of Gaza telling us to be patient. Like their resilience, subhanAllah, their resilience is so spectacular that it puts us to shame. And the last thing I will say is this. Over 50% of Gaza is inhabited by children. So, I don't know when was the last time you guys did some chronological math, but I'll do some for you. A fighting-aged male in Gaza is probably between 18 to 24 years old. Okay? So that means he was born sometime between 2004 to 2007. It means he was born in a cage. Okay? If he's really old, a fighting-aged male would have been born maybe around the year 2000. Something like that. Okay? If he was born around the year 2000, that means he opened his eyes to watch Muhammad al-Durrah get killed on TV. 2007, he watches his home blockaded by the land, sea, and air. 2009, he experiences his first major war. 2011, he experiences his second. 2014, he experiences his third. 2021, he experiences his fourth. 2022, he experiences his fifth. He's now on his sixth major Israeli bombardment. The fact that there is anyone in Gaza with any humanity at all is remarkable. The fact that when any youth in Gaza, when you ask a single one of them, what do you want to be when you're older? The fact that any of them actually have an answer other than fighter is remarkable. And the fact that when the gates of Gaza were opened, that they did not cannibalize their neighbors is actually remarkable. Because I want you to put yourself in the shoes of someone who has experienced that much oppression in their life. Which brings me to the last point that I will say. We are witnessing a display of what, of course, we're witnessing a truly unprecedented Western hypocrisy. But all of the rage that I have described for you is insufficient to justify any form of resistance in the eyes of the imperial powers of the world. All of the rage that I have described to you is not enough to justify for the Palestinians to engage in any form of resistance or dissatisfaction with the Zionist movement. But the rage that the Zionists feel at the losses that they have suffered not only justifies their rage, but it apparently is justification for the annihilation of every single person in Gaza. When the invasion of Iraq happened, I was a teenager. I'm not a teenager anymore. My parents don't speak English as well as I do. They couldn't do the things that we're doing. But if you have a voice, you are obligated to say something. You cannot stay silent. Our ancestors did not travel from around the world and put us in these fancy schools and teach us all the things that we know just so that we could stay quiet, so we could keep our job as Amazon truck drivers, or we could have our little tech job at Microsoft or wherever. Okay? You're expecting the ultimate sacrifice from your brothers and sisters around the world, and you won't even talk? This is the source of shame. This is where I feel shame. Any questions about that or about the actual